In the dawn haze of the ancient Mediterranean, where the salt of the sea mingled with incense and ambition, there rose a city conceived not merely as a port or a palace but as an idea made stone, a declaration that human knowledge itself could be gathered, ordered, and mastered, and as the narrator's voice cuts through rolling shots of sunlit columns and restless waves crashing against the Pharos lighthouse, we are drawn inexorably into Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, a city engineered to be the crossroads of the world, where Greek reason met Egyptian antiquity, Persian administration, Babylonian astronomy, Indian mathematics, and the oral traditions of Africa, and at the very heart of this grand experiment stood an institution unlike any the world had ever known, the great Library of Alexandria, not a single building but a living organism of scholarship embedded within the Mouseion, a temple to the Muses, where knowledge was not stored passively but hunted, copied, debated, challenged, and expanded, and as the camera glides through imagined marble halls filled with papyrus scrolls stacked floor to ceiling, the narrator intones that this was humanity's first global research institute, a place where kings funded curiosity and scholars were granted food, lodging, stipends, and freedom from taxes so they could pursue one singular mission, to understand everything, and this ambition was no metaphor, for under the reign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, particularly Ptolemy Isoter and his successor Ptolemy II Philadelphus, agents were dispatched across the known world to acquire texts. Ships entering Alexandria's harbor were searched for books which were seized, copied, and often replaced with replicas while the originals were kept, labeled ominously as from the ships, and within these walls accumulated works of mathematics, medicine, engineering, philosophy, geography, drama, theology, and natural science on a scale unprecedented. Estimates ranging from 40,000 to as many as 400,000 scrolls, each representing years of thought, observation, and experimentation, and as historians' voices layer over one another, we hear names that would become pillars of civilization, Euclid compiling the elements and defining geometry for the next 2 millennia, Archimedes calculating pi and devising principles of buoyancy that would underpin physics, Eratosthenes measuring the circumference of the Earth with shocking accuracy using shadows and reason alone, Hipparchus mapping the stars and discovering the precession of the equinoxes, Herophilus dissecting human bodies and identifying the brain as the center of intelligence, and in these halls scholars argued not only what was true but how truth itself should be determined, birthing the scientific method in its earliest form, and the library's mission extended beyond preservation into synthesis, translating texts into Greek, most famously the Hebrew scriptures in the Septuagint, allowing ideas to cross linguistic and cultural boundaries, and as the narrator lowers his voice, emphasizing the stakes, we are told that this was the moment humanity first stood on the brink of a unified understanding of nature, technology, and itself, a moment where steam power, hinted at in hero of Alexandria's Aeolipile, might have been refined centuries earlier, where advanced mechanical engineering, automata, precise astronomy, and medical knowledge could have accelerated civilization beyond its slow historical crawl, and yet, beneath this brilliance, shadows gathered, for the library existed within a volatile world of empires, religious upheavals, and political rivalries, and as the camera darkens and drums roll softly beneath the narration, we see Alexandria not as an ivory tower isolated from history but as a fragile flame surrounded by storms, beginning with its entanglement in power struggles following Alexander's death, as his generals carved the empire into rival kingdoms, and the Ptolemies, desperate to legitimize their rule over Egypt, weaponized knowledge as propaganda, tying scholarship to royal authority, making the library both protected and perilously dependent on political favor, and this dependence would prove fatal, for in 48 BCE, as Julius Caesar pursued Pompey into Egypt, Alexandria became a battlefield, and during the chaos, fire spread through the harbor, consuming ships and warehouses, and ancient sources hint, controversially and contentiously, that part of the library's collection may have burned in this conflagration, a moment shrouded in debate, uncertainty, and myth. But even if this fire did not annihilate the library, it wounded it, scattering texts and scholars, initiating a slow erosion rather than a single apocalyptic blaze, and as Rome absorbed Egypt, the library's fortunes waned, its funding diminished, its mission diluted, while new centers of power rose elsewhere, and yet it endured. Partially relocated to the Serapeum, continuing as a beacon amid decline, until the 3rd century CE when Emperor Aurelian's reconquest of Alexandria from Queen Zenobia's Pomeranian Empire brought further destruction, urban warfare tearing through the Bruttian district where the original library once stood, and here the narrator pauses, letting silence speak, because this is where certainty ends and loss begins to echo. And as centuries pass in a rapid montage of crumbling statues and shifting banners, religious transformation sweeps the empire, Christianity rising from persecuted sect to state power, and with it comes a new relationship to pagan knowledge, complex and often contradictory, some Christian scholars preserving Greek learning while others denounced it as heretical. And in 391 CE, under Emperor Theodosius I, pagan temples were ordered closed, culminating in the destruction of the Serapeum, an act recorded by contemporaries that marked not only the physical dismantling of a sanctuary but the symbolic collapse of Alexandria's ancient scholarly tradition. And although debate rages among modern historians about whether the Great Library still existed in recognizable form at this point, what is undeniable is that the ecosystem that sustained it was gone, replaced by a world increasingly hostile to the open-ended inquiry that had defined the Mouseion, and as the documentary's pacing intensifies, the narrator frames the loss not as a single moment of destruction but as a drawn-out intellectual extinction, a death by neglect, ideology, and violence, compounded later by the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, an event often falsely blamed for the library's destruction through apocryphal tales of scrolls burned to heat bathhouses. Stories modern scholars largely dismiss as legend, yet legends themselves reveal how deeply the loss resonated, how civilizations sought villains to explain a void too vast to comprehend, and that void is where the documentary now lingers, as the camera pans across empty shelves dissolving into darkness. Because what vanished with the library was not merely books but pathways of thought, alternative histories of science where Earth's mechanics, medicine, and engineering might have advanced exponentially sooner, and experts explain that without these texts, later civilizations were forced to rediscover principles already known, repeating experiments, retracing steps, sometimes failing to recover insights entirely, and the consequences ripple outward through time, delaying technological revolutions, shaping religious doctrine, constraining philosophical frameworks, and as the narrator's voice swells with solemn gravity, we are reminded that much of what survived did so by chance, copied by monks, preserved in Islamic libraries during the Abbasid Golden Age, or buried in forgotten corners of the world, while countless works, treatises on advanced mathematics, lost plays of Sophocles and Euripides, detailed maps of distant lands, mechanical blueprints, medical case studies, and philosophical schools vanished without record, leaving humanity with a fragmented inheritance. And this is the central mystery of Alexandria, not merely how it was lost, but what was lost with it. And as part I draws to a close, the narrator poses the question that will haunt the remainder of this documentary, a question that echoes through ruined halls and across millennia, asking not only what the great library of Alexandria knew, but who we might have become had its light never been extinguished, setting the stage for an even deeper exploration of the consequences, the rediscoveries, and the haunting possibility that the future itself was delayed when the world's first and greatest library fell silent. As the screen fades back in from black, the narrator's voice returns lower, heavier, carrying the weight of centuries, and we move not forward but outward, across deserts, monasteries, caliphates, and laboratories, because the true story of the great Library of Alexandria does not end with its disappearance but begins anew in its absence, in the long shadow cast over human progress by what was no longer there. And experts remind us that history is not merely shaped by what survives but by what vanishes, for when Alexandria's vast archive dissolved into ash, neglect, and oblivion, humanity did not simply lose information, it lost momentum, losing entire schools of thought that had already solved problems later generations would struggle with for centuries. And as illuminated manuscripts dissolve into animated diagrams, we see how ancient engineers had already grasped principles of hydraulics, pneumatics, and mechanical automation, how heroes' devices hinted at programmable machines, how Tiszabius pioneered compressed air and water clocks of astonishing precision, and historians speculate with cautious authority that sustained institutional support could have transformed these curiosities into engines of industry long before the Industrial Revolution, potentially reshaping labor, urbanization, and even concepts of time itself. But without the library's central archive, these ideas scattered, fragmented into isolated references stripped of context. And as Rome fell and Europe entered centuries of political fragmentation, much of this knowledge lay dormant, not destroyed everywhere but inaccessible, untranslated, misunderstood, and the documentary cuts to candlelit scriptoria where medieval monks painstakingly copied fragments of Aristotle and Galen, preserving slivers of antiquity while remaining unaware of the broader frameworks once housed in Alexandria, and the narrator emphasizes that this was not ignorance but survival, a civilization clutching at remnants while the cohesive intellectual ecosystem that once connected mathematics to astronomy, medicine to philosophy, and engineering to empirical observation was gone. And yet, history is never linear, and as the camera sweeps eastward, the story pivots to the Islamic Golden Age, where Baghdad's House of Wisdom emerges as a distant echo of Alexandria, a deliberate attempt to rebuild what had been lost, fueled by Abbasid caliphs who sponsored massive translation movements, salvaging Greek Texts from Byzantium, Persia, and beyond, and scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Biruni did not merely preserve ancient knowledge but expanded it, developing algebra, refining medicine, advancing optics, and calculating planetary motion with unprecedented rigor. And here experts draw a crucial distinction, noting that Islamic scholars were not inheritors of Alexandria's fullness but reconstructors working from fragments, rebuilding a cathedral from scattered stones. And while this revival would later feed into the European Renaissance, accelerating progress after centuries of stagnation, the narrator poses the unsettling question of how much faster humanity might have advanced had this chain of transmission never been broken, had the library's continuous lineage of inquiry survived intact, and as Renaissance workshops burst onto the screen with gears, telescopes, and anatomical sketches, we witness Europe's rediscovery of ideas once known, as Copernicus overturns geocentrism with echoes of Aristarchus, as Vesalius corrects Galen through direct observation, unknowingly retracing steps taken by Alexandrian anatomists, and as Newton famously declares that he stood on the shoulders of giants. The narrator reminds us that many of those giants once stood together in Alexandria, their collective height lost to time, forcing later thinkers to climb alone, and the consequences of this loss extend beyond technology into philosophy and worldview, for the library fostered a pluralistic intellectual culture where multiple hypotheses coexisted, debated rigorously rather than suppressed, and historians argue that its destruction coincided with a narrowing of acceptable inquiry, as dogma, whether imperial or religious, increasingly dictated truth, slowing the acceptance of heliocentrism, evolution, and experimental science. And as the documentary intercuts between inquisitorial courts and early laboratories, the narrator underscores that the absence of a centralized, protected institution for free inquiry made knowledge vulnerable to power, ideology, and fear, and this vulnerability shaped geopolitics, delaying navigation advances that could have connected continents sooner, postponing medical breakthroughs that might have saved millions from plagues, and constraining engineering developments that could have transformed agriculture and infrastructure. And while it is tempting to imagine a utopian alternative history, the documentary resists fantasy, grounding its analysis in cautious scholarship, acknowledging that progress is never guaranteed, yet insisting that Alexandria represented a unique convergence of resources, diversity, and ambition that has never been fully replicated. And as modern scientists appear on screen, standing amid particle accelerators and digital archives, they draw direct lines between the library's mission and contemporary efforts to preserve knowledge in an age of unprecedented data creation and equally unprecedented risk, warning that digital decay, censorship, warfare, and climate catastrophe pose modern parallels to ancient loss, and the narrator's tone shifts from elegy to warning as images of burning museums, bombed universities, and corrupted servers flash by, reminding us that the story of Alexandria is not ancient history but a recurring pattern. And then, in a final act of reflection, the documentary returns to the human element, to the unnamed scholars whose works vanished without trace, whose questions, experiments, and insights died with them, leaving no echo, and the narrator asks us to consider not only the inventions we lost but the questions we never learned to ask, the alternative philosophies that might have reshaped ethics, governance, and humanity's relationship with nature, and as the camera drifts through a digital reconstruction of the library, scrolls reforming briefly before dissolving into light, the voice concludes with solemn authority that the great Library of Alexandria was not merely a building or a collection but a declaration that knowledge belongs to humanity as a whole, transcending borders, faiths, and generations, and its destruction stands as both tragedy and lesson, a reminder that civilization advances not just through discovery but through preservation, not just through brilliance but through continuity, and in the final moments, as the music swells and the screen fades to black, the narrator leaves us with a charge rather than a lament, asserting that while Alexandria's shelves are empty, its legacy endures as a challenge to our own age, to safeguard knowledge, to foster open inquiry, and to recognize that the future is shaped as much by what we choose to protect as by what we dare to imagine. Because somewhere in the silence left by the great Library of Alexandria lies not only the story of what was lost, but the responsibility of what must never be lost again.